So, how are data breaches actually happening? Well, it turns out it's a training issue. I'm Woody Huffines, and I own the NerdsToGo in McKinney, Texas. And this is Tech for the Untechnical. Verizon just came out with their breach incident report, which is the big report that they do every year that talk about what the incidents or what the breaches are that caused businesses problems. And this year they surveyed 157,000 something different data breaches, and they went to look to see what were the causes of the breaches or what could we find out from those breaches. And there were 6 main takeaways. And the first takeaway is it's the users. The story that I tell is about when I had a group of people that we did our own help desk. We were managing an application that was a application for people to run queries and data queries, and they would get into trouble running a data query, wouldn't get the results that they wanted, and the help desk really couldn't help them. So we ran our own help desk for that application. And as the manager, I went to look through the problem log to see what the problems were, to see if there's something that we could do to keep the users from having so many problems. And I looked at the log, and the solutions were picnic, and this, so and so called, and picnic was the solution, and picnic, and about 65 or 70% of the solutions in our help desk log was picnic. So I called in my help desk lead and I said, what does picnic mean? She said, problem in chair, not in computer. And it turns out from the Verizon data breach or the breach incident report, that seems to be a common problem. 96% of the data breaches that they experienced, or 96% of the largest set of the data breaches, were user given somebody an answer that they shouldn't have been given, either in an email or clicking on the wrong link. And the other big piece of it is passwords, password hacking, either brute force attacks on passwords. They just try passwords until they get in, or when password database gets out, they try to reuse those passwords. And there's tens of billions of credential combinations out on the dark web, tens of billions, where you have a username and password that people can try against different systems. So the key here is password hygiene. Make sure that your passwords are good. There's a video up here about password hygiene. Look into that. Making sure that you don't reuse passwords, number one. Number two, use a password manager. Here's a video about using a password manager so that you have stronger passwords. The next thing is use multi-factor authentication, and here's a video on multi-factor authentication. Seems like we've talked about some of these things. The second biggest source of breaches were user error, either misdelivery, somebody sent the wrong data to the right person, or the right data to the wrong person, but it was just somebody torched off a data set someplace that they shouldn't have, which is just user error, or a misconfiguration. And this is particularly a problem in web design, web applications, and we'll talk about that at the bottom. So the next biggest breach was user error. Just somebody made a mistake in how they managed the data or managed the connections. Again, picnic. The third thing that they found is that most of the data breaches are external rather than internal. One of the things that you do in the IT world, or that you should be doing in your IT world, whether it's your home or your business, is making sure that your users, the people inside the fence, aren't exfiltrating data and sending the wrong data out. See the user error above. So 70% of the breaches that were a bad actor, 70% of them were somebody outside the organization, but still that leaves 30% inside the organization, and 80% of the ones that happened inside the organization were financial gain. So pay attention for your users inside your organization or inside your home, who has the ability to gain monetarily from doing something nefarious. The other thing is that all those users were external. 85% of the breaches occurred from within the same country. So in the United States, 85% of the breaches came from the United States. A majority of the breaches came from the same state. 56% came from that same state, and 35% of the external breaches came from the same city, which is a pretty good indication that you've got a lot of local issues that you need to be concerned about when you're trying to secure your data, because it's the people in your city that might know a little bit more about your organization and what you're doing than somebody in the Ukraine. The next thing that they found is that the defense in depth works. It used to be that there was a chain of events that would happen. The hacker would do, he'd send some malware, and then somebody would execute the malware, and the malware would make a presence on the machine. Then the malware would spread to other machines in the network, and then they'd get to the vulnerable machine, and then the vulnerable machine would get, and they don't do that much anymore. Now the attacks are as simple as they can be, which is to the hacker's advantage, because if it's a 5 or 6 step attack as opposed to a 1-step attack, there's a much better chance that you're going to catch him. Now, go back to multi-factor authentication, but the idea that defense in depth would have stopped a lot of the attacks, because if they have to go through 3 steps and they have to get through 3 different security measures, that's better for you. So use a password manager. Security measure 1, password manager. We've talked about this. Number 2, use multi-factor authentication. If you use multi-factor authentication with a password manager, and then number 3, use a good antivirus. There's 3 levels of things that attacker has to defeat. So defense in depth is always a good thing. The next thing they found that was not surprising is that cloud applications or web applications are where most of the attacks occur. It's a lot more difficult, because if you have an application that you're using on the web, you have to depend on that web application's security as well as your security. So somebody can get to your data if they hack you or they hack the web app. And this is particularly true of misconfigurations of AWS or Amazon databases. We see things happening all the time where Amazon database, somebody doesn't set the security right, which is A, user error, and B, it's outside of your control. So web applications are another thing you pay attention to. And those web applications are subject to credential stuffing attacks, credential stuffing, passwords, we'll talk here. And if that web application is out there, you're depending on someone else for your security. And finally, the big thing that they found is that malware, or the incidence of malware, is actually going down as being the primary cause of a data breach. Think about it. Remember, the first thing we talked about is poor password management and stolen passwords or stolen credentials. Well, if you're a bad guy and you have to install malware and you have to get past the antivirus and you got to get in there to get the malware in and then crawl the network and do a bunch of stuff, it's a lot easier if you can trick a user into giving you their username and password. So the incidence of malware and complex attacks is going down because phishing and getting people tricked into, through social engineering, giving up information they shouldn't give is a much more efficient way to do it. So the takeaway here, the big takeaway for small business and homes, is use strong passwords. Use strong passwords by using a password manager. Password manager, we've talked about this. And use multi-factor authentication, because if you use multi-factor authentication, 98% of those external credential stuffing attacks are stopped dead in their tracks. I'm Woody Huffines. I own the NerdsToGo in McKinney and Frisco, Texas. This is Tech for the Untechnical. You know the drill. Hit the buttons below. Give us a comment. Y'all be safe.